My name is Jonah. Most people remember me as the man who was swallowed by a great fish. But I prefer to think of myself as the man who learned that you can never truly outrun the reach of grace. It is a long story, but we have all the time in the world. The night in Gath Hefer was usually so still. I remember the smell of the dry earth cooling under the stars, a hint of dust and wild thyme in the air. I was comfortable. I was settled. But the word of the Lord has a way of stirring the quietest of rooms. "Arise," he said. "Go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." I remember sitting bolt upright in the dark. Nineveh? The capital of the Assyrians? They were not exactly the kind of people you wanted to visit for a friendly chat. They were, well, let's just say they weren't known for their hospitality. So I did what any sensible prophet would do when faced with a divine command he didn't like. I went the exact opposite direction. The road to Joppa was long, and the moon followed me like a silver coin rolling across the sky. I could hear the rhythmic crunch of my sandals on the gravel. Crunch, crunch, crunch. A steady beat that tried to drown out the voice in my heart. But you see, the thing about the Creator of the heavens and the earth is that He made the gravel too. He made the road, and He certainly made the sea. When I reached the port of Joppa, the air changed. It became heavy with the scent of salt spray and old cedar wood. The harbor was a forest of masts, swaying gently in the dark water. I found a ship bound for Tarshish, as far away from Nineveh as a man could possibly go. I paid my fare. I remember the clink of the coins in the captain's hand. It felt like a finality, a way to buy my silence. As the ship began to creak and pull away from the dock, I went down into the lowest part of the hold. It was dark down there. The smell of grain and damp hemp was thick and earthy. I wrapped my cloak around me and laid down. I thought I was escaping. I thought I could sleep through the call. But as the psalmist says, "Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me." I didn't want to be held just then. I wanted to be lost. I fell into a deep, heavy sleep, lulled by the gentle rocking of the boat. It was a deceptive peace, the kind of quiet that comes right before the wind begins to whisper a different name. The ship groaned, a low, rhythmic sound at first, just the wood complaining against the tide. But then the whisper of the wind turned into a low hum, and the hum turned into a roar. The Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest. The waves began to climb like jagged mountains made of obsidian. I could hear the sailors above me shouting, their voices thin and desperate against the booming of the thunder. Every man was crying out to his own God. They were throwing the cargo overboard to lighten the ship, boxes of fine linen and jars of oil splashing into the foam. All that work, all that profit, discarded just to stay afloat for one more minute. And there I was, fast asleep in the hold, while the world was turning upside down. I can still feel the hand of the ship's captain on my shoulder, shaking me awake. His face was pale, glistening with sea spray in the dim light of the lantern. "What meanest thou, O sleeper? Arise, call upon thy God. If so be that God will think upon us, that we perish not." I stood up, my legs swaying with the violent tilt of the floor. I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, I knew this wasn't just a storm. This was a conversation, and the sea was doing all the talking. I climbed the wooden ladder leading up from the belly of the ship, my hands gripping the damp rungs as the vessel groaned under the weight of the Atlantic. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the rocking of the boat, but because of the weight of my own choices. When my head finally cleared the hatch, the world was no longer blue and gold. It was a swirling chaos of slate gray and frothing white. The wind didn't just blow, it shrieked, a wild, ancient sound that seemed to pull the very air from my lungs. The sailors were huddled together near the mast, their faces etched with a terror that surpassed common fear. These were men of the sea, men who knew every mood of the Mediterranean. But this was different. The water didn't just splash, it boiled. "Come!" they cried out to one another, their voices barely reaching me over the roar. "Let us cast lots, that we may know for whose cause this evil is upon us." I watched them. The sound of the lots clicking against the wet wood of the deck was a tiny, sharp noise in the midst of the thunder. Click, click, click. A rhythmic gamble against the divine. And as surely as the sun rises in the east, the lot fell on me. A dozen pairs of eyes fixed on me, reflecting the lightning that cracked open the sky. I stood there, dripping wet, smelling of the dusty hold and the sharp tang of salt, a prophet who had tried to retire early. "Tell us," they pleaded, breathing hard as they gripped the ropes to stay upright. "We pray thee, for whose cause this evil is upon us. What is thine occupation, and whence comest thou? What is thy country, and of what people art thou?" I took a long breath, tasting the cold mist on my tongue. There was no more use in hiding. You cannot hide behind a mask when the Creator is looking directly at your heart. "I am a Hebrew," I said, my voice steadying as the truth finally found its way out. "And I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, which hath made the sea and the dry land." The irony was not lost on me. I was claiming to fear the God of the sea while I was currently trying to use his sea to run away from him. It was a funny thing, in a tragic sort of way, how we think we can use a creator's own tools to escape his presence. When the sailors heard this, a new kind of fear took hold of them. It wasn't just the fear of drowning anymore. It was the holy awe of standing in the middle of someone else's argument with the Almighty. "Why hast thou done this?" they asked, their voices trembling like the sails above us. They knew the sea was getting more and more tempestuous against them. The waves were no longer just waves. They were walls of liquid obsidian, towering high, blocking out the stars, before crashing down with the weight of a falling mountain. I looked out over the railing. The water was dark, deeper than any sleep, and I knew the only way to quiet the storm was to face the one who had stirred it. "Take me up," I told them, feeling a strange, cold peace begin to settle over me, "and cast me forth into the sea. So shall the sea be calm unto you. For I know that for my sake this great tempest is upon us." But these men, these pagans I had looked down upon, they had more mercy in their pinky fingers than I had in my whole body at that moment. They didn't want to throw me over. They rowed hard, their muscles straining, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they tried to bring the ship back to land. I could hear the rhythmic thud of the oars, splash, pull, Heave, splash, pull, heave. But the sea grew even more violent against them. It was as if the water itself was reaching out, pulling the oars from their hands, laughing at their strength. They finally realized that you cannot fight the wind when it has a purpose. They cried out to the Lord, "My God," not theirs, saying, "We beseech thee, O Lord, we beseech thee. Let us not perish for this man's life." I felt the rough calluses of their hands as they finally lifted me up. The wood of the railing was cold against my palms. I looked down into the churning abyss, the foam looking like lace against the dark throat of the ocean. And then, with a heavy heave, they let go. The sensation of falling is a strange thing. It felt like time stretched out, the wind whistling past my ears, the sound of the ship's creaking wood fading away, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like velvet. And then, the impact. The water was not cold as I expected. It was heavy, a weight that immediately pressed against my chest, pulling me down into the blue-black shadows. I closed my eyes, expecting the end, but as I sank, the surface of the water above me suddenly became smooth as glass. The storm had stopped. The conversation was over, and a new chapter was about to begin in the deep. The first thing I felt was the silence. After the screaming of the gale and the frantic shouts of the sailors, the water was a heavy velvet curtain that muffled the world. It was a strange kind of peace. Cold, yes, but remarkably still. I watched the hull of the ship grow smaller and smaller above me, a dark splinter against the silver surface of the waves, until it vanished entirely into the gray. I began to sink deeper. The pressure was a gentle but firm hand, pushing against my chest, pressing into my ears. I didn't fight it. There is a point where running stops, and the realization of your own smallness begins to settle in. I was just a man, a stubborn man, drifting in the vast, dark blue of God's great pantry. The light changed as I descended. It shifted from the frothy white of the surface to a deep, bruised purple, and then to a midnight blue that felt thick enough to touch. I could see bubbles dancing past my face like tiny, translucent pearls, rising up to a world I thought I would never see again. I felt the current catch me, pulling me down toward the foundations of the world. The water was compassing me about, even to the soul. I could feel the swaying of the great underwater forests, the long, slimy ribbons of kelp that reached up from the floor of the sea. The weeds were wrapped about my head, soft and slick like silk ribbons. I thought, so this is it. This is how the story of Jonah ends. Not with a shout, but with a quiet drift into the dark. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me, seemingly forever. It is a curious thing, how clearly you can think when the world goes quiet. I remember thinking about the mountains back home, the heat of the sun on the limestone rocks, and how different it was from this cold, liquid weight. I felt the heartbeat of the ocean, a slow, rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. And then, the light changed again. Or rather, the darkness changed. A shadow moved beneath me. It wasn't the jagged shadow of a rock or the spindly shadow of a reef. It was something vast, something alive. It was a shadow that had its own purpose. It moved with a slow, powerful grace, a mountain of flesh and muscle gliding through the deep. I felt a sudden rush of water, a massive displacement of the sea that sent me spinning like a leaf in a whirlpool. I didn't feel teeth. I didn't feel a bite. I simply felt a sudden, overwhelming intake of breath, as if the sea itself were being sucked into a great cavern. The world went from blue-black to absolute pitch darkness in the blink of an eye. I was no longer sinking. I was sliding. I felt the rush of salt water carrying me along a smooth, warm passage, a tunnel made of living stone. It was a strange sensation, like being caught in a gentle slide at a village fair, if the slide were made of wet velvet and smelled faintly of old brine and mystery. And then I stopped. I landed on something soft, something that yielded under my weight like a damp mattress. I sat up, or at least I tried to. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of the sea and something deep and earthy. It was warm. After the biting cold of the deep water, this warmth was an unexpected mercy. I reached out my hand. I could feel the walls, if you could call them walls. They were smooth and slightly ribbed, like the ceiling of a great hall, but they were pulsing, a slow, steady, rhythmic beat. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of the great fish. I was sitting in the belly of a living cathedral, a creature prepared by the Lord specifically to hold a runaway prophet. I sat there in the dark, my heart racing as I tried to wrap my mind around my new accommodations. I was alive. I should have been drowned, my lungs filled with the brine. But here I was, breathing. The air was strange, yes, and the floor was a bit squishy, but I was breathing. I remember laughing, a small, shaky sound that echoed strangely in the hollow of the fish's gut. I had tried to run across the sea to get away from God, and he had simply sent a fish to pick me up and give me a place to think. The Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah, and I was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. It was a long time to be alone with your thoughts. The only sound was the rush of water outside the creature's skin, a distant, muffled roar, and the steady drumming of its heart. I leaned my back against the living wall. It moved slightly with every breath the creature took. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running. I was just there, in the dark, in the deep, in the hand of something much bigger than myself. The darkness wasn't scary anymore. It felt like a blanket, a very moist, rhythmic blanket. Imagine, if you will, a room that breathes. Not the drafty, unsettling rattling of an old house in a winter wind, but a deep, rhythmic expansion and contraction of the very walls around you. It was a cathedral made of muscle and mystery, a living chamber where the silence was not empty, but heavy with the weight of the ocean above. I sat there, tucked into a corner of the great fish's belly, my legs pulled up to my chest. The floor was soft, a bit slippery, yes, but it was the first time in days that my heart hadn't been racing to keep up with my feet. There is a strange clarity that comes when you are 3 stories below the waves, inside a creature that could swallow a chariot and never notice the crunch. You stop worrying about the small things, like whether you left your spare sandals in Joppa, or if the neighbors back home are wondering why your garden is growing wild. All those little anxieties, They simply float away when the reality of your situation is this vast. I reached out into the dark, feeling the gentle warmth of the creature. It was like being wrapped in a heavy, wet blanket. But strangely, I wasn't cold anymore. The sea outside was freezing, a vast, icy expanse that could turn a man to stone. But in here, it was the temperature of life itself. It was a humid, earthy warmth that felt like the breath of the earth. I began to talk, not out loud at first, just a quiet murmur in the theater of my mind. I had a lot to say, and for once, I had a captive audience. Or perhaps I was the captive. It's all a matter of perspective, isn't it? I cried by reason of mine affliction unto the Lord. I whispered, and the words seemed to float in the thick air before settling into the rhythm of the heartbeats. He heard me. Out of the belly of hell, cried I, and thou heardest my voice. It's funny. I had spent weeks trying to stay silent, trying to keep my distance from the divine. I thought if I didn't speak, he wouldn't see me. And yet, here I was, in the dark, at the very bottom of the world, and the connection was clearer than it had ever been in the temple. The fish made a low, booming sound, a vibration that I felt in my teeth. It was diving deeper. I could feel the pressure change slightly, a gentle squeezing of the space. We were moving past the reefs, past the shipwrecks and the skeletons of old empires, down to where the water is as thick as oil and as black as ink. I thought about the light, the way the sun hits the olive trees in Galilee, the way the dust motes dance in the late afternoon heat of the marketplace. It felt like a dream from another life. In here, time didn't move in minutes or hours. It moved in pulses. Thump, thump, thump. I realized then that I wasn't just a prisoner. I was a guest, a very damp, very confused, very humbled guest. I had asked to be thrown away, and instead, I had been tucked into a pocket of the sea to be kept safe. I remember thinking, Lord, you have a very peculiar way of showing mercy. But then, I suppose a prophet who runs away in a boat has a very peculiar way of showing obedience. We were quite a pair, the Creator and I, arguing in the deep. The walls around me began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent light, a soft green shimmer that danced on the surface of the digestive pools. It was beautiful, in a terrifying sort of way. It was as if the stars had decided to come down and visit the abyss, just to remind me that there is no place where the light cannot reach. I felt a sudden lurch, a graceful turn of the massive body. We were soaring through the currents now. I leaned my head back against the ribbed ceiling and closed my eyes. The sound of the water rushing past the outside of the fish was a constant, soothing white noise, like the sound of 1,000 fountains playing all at once. Thou hadst cast me into the deep, I prayed, into the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed me about. All thy billows and thy waves passed over me. Then I said, I am cast out of thy sight, yet I will look again toward thy holy temple. I couldn't see the temple. I couldn't see the sky. But in that moment, I could see the truth. You can't outrun the one who made the legs you're running on. The very air I was breathing, though it was salty and thick, was a gift I didn't deserve. The darkness was my companion now, It was soft. It was heavy. It was patient. And as I lay there, the heartbeat of the fish became the heartbeat of my own soul. I was being carried, not to my end, but to a new beginning. By the second day, you begin to lose track of where the fish ends and where you begin. The passage of time in the deep is not marked by the rising of the sun or the shifting of shadows across a sundial, but by the slow, rhythmic pulsing of the great creature's life. It is a world of echoes and vibrations, a symphony of the subaquatic that hums in your very marrow. I remember the sensation of the fish diving, truly diving, down toward the roots of the world. The pressure outside must have been immense, enough to crush a cedar of Lebanon into a toothpick. Yet inside my living sanctuary, I felt only a gentle, heavy snugness. It was as if the ocean were trying to give me a giant, liquid hug, one that lasted for hours. The waters compassed me about, even to the soul. I whispered into the humid darkness. The depth closed me round about. The weeds were wrapped about my head. It wasn't just a metaphor. Occasionally, the fish would take in a great gulp of the sea, and a few strands of long, slippery kelp would find their way into my little chamber, cool and slick against my skin like ribbons of green silk. It wasn't exactly the five-star accommodation I might have hoped for in Tarshish, but the rent was free and the company was quiet. I found a particularly soft fold in the creature's lining and made myself a sort of nest. I sat there, listening to the digestive hum, thinking about how funny it was that I had tried so hard to find a ship with a comfortable bed, only to end up sleeping on the internal organs of a leviathan. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains, I said, feeling the fish glide past the jagged, underwater peaks of the Mediterranean ridge. The earth with her bars was about me forever. Yet hast thou brought up my life from corruption, O Lord my God. Even in the dark, I could feel the majesty of it. We were drifting through canyons that no human eye had ever seen, past forests of coral that glowed with their own internal fire, and through schools of fish that moved like silver clouds in a midnight sky. I couldn't see them with my eyes, but I could feel the displacement of the water, the thousands of tiny heartbeats fluttering past our massive hull. I started to think about Nineveh again. It's funny how the mind works when you have nothing to do but breathe and exist. In the sunlight, Nineveh seemed like a place of terror, a city of stone and cruelty. But down here, in the velvet silence of the abyss, it just seemed small. Everyone seemed small. We were all just creatures, drifting in the currents of a will much larger than our own. The king of Nineveh, the sailors on the boat, the fish carrying me, and the runaway prophet tucked in its belly. We were all being held by the same hand. I began to hum a little tune, a simple melody from my childhood. The sound bounced off the ribbed walls, creating a soft, layered harmony that seemed to please the fish. It let out a long, low, vibrating moan that shook my entire body. It was a friendly sound, a conversation between two travelers who both knew they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The air was thick and smelled of salt and ancient things, like an old library that had been submerged in the sea for 1,000 years. It wasn't a bad smell. It was the smell of history, of the deep things that remain when the surface is all storm and noise. I felt a sudden, graceful tilt. We were no longer diving. We were leveling out. cruising through the mid-depths where the water is a constant, cool indigo. The swaying was so steady, so hypnotic, that I felt my eyelids growing heavy. When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord. I murmured, and my prayer came in unto thee, into thine holy temple. My temple just happened to have gills and a tail. I leaned my head back, feeling the warmth of the living wall against my neck. Thump, thump, thump. The heartbeat of the fish was a metronome for my peace. I wasn't running anymore. I was resting. And for the first time in my life, I understood that sometimes you have to be swallowed by a storm to finally find the quiet. The fish gave another slow, powerful stroke of its tail, and I felt us beginning a long, slow arc. We were turning. I didn't know where we were headed, but I knew the one who was steering. I closed my eyes, letting the bioluminescent shimmer fade into the back of my mind. The darkness was a gift. The silence was a sanctuary. And the deep was just another word for home. Would you like to hear about the third day and the moment the light finally broke back through the waves? The third day began not with the golden rays of a sunrise, but with a subtle shift in the temperature of the water outside. I could feel it through the thick, pulsing walls of my host, a gradual warming as we left the icy trenches of the abyss and began to rise toward the sunlit world. I'd spent a lot of time thinking about my life in those 48 hours. It's funny how a little solitude and a lot of fish scales can clear a man's vision. I thought about the lying vanities I had chased, the pride that told me I knew better than the one who laid the foundations of the deep. They that observe lying vanities forsake their own mercy, I whispered to the shadows, my voice sounding a little raspier than before. I had been so busy worrying about my reputation as a prophet that I had almost walked away from the very mercy I was now depending on to breathe. I felt a sudden change in the rhythm of our movement. The fish was no longer gliding in long, sweeping arcs. It was moving with purpose now, its powerful tail thrashing with a renewed energy that sent me sliding gently from one side of my guest room to the other. I could hear the sound of the surface. It's a different kind of roar, more chaotic than the deep, a crashing and tumbling of waves against the shore. We were close. I could feel the creature navigating the shoals, the water becoming shallower and shallower, until I could almost imagine the light dancing through its skin. I knew my time in this living sanctuary was coming to an end. My heart began to drum a little faster, matching the pace of the great beast's own rhythmic thumping. I felt a surge of gratitude, a strange, overwhelming desire to simply say, "Thank you for the damp, dark rescue. I will sacrifice unto thee with the voice of thanksgiving," I said, bracing myself against a ribbed wall. "I will pay that I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord." As soon as those words left my lips, the fish seemed to agree. Or perhaps it had simply had enough of its passenger. I felt a sudden, massive contraction, a tightening of the walls that felt like the world was giving me one last firm squeeze. The fish didn't just stop. It surged forward, its massive body sliding over the sandy bottom of the shallows. I could hear the grit of the earth against its belly, a sound like 1,000 tiny diamonds scratching against a drum. And then, the great ejection. I felt a rush of water, a sudden, powerful surge that carried me upward and outward. I wasn't sliding anymore. I was being propelled. The dark velvet gave way to a blinding, searing light that hit my eyes like a physical blow. I tumbled through the air for a brief, weightless moment, smelling the incredible, sharp scent of dry land. And then I hit the sand. It wasn't a graceful landing. I rolled and skidded, a tangle of wet limbs and seaweed, until I came to a stop on the warm, dry shore. I lay there for a long time, my face pressed into the sand, breathing in the heat of the sun and the smell of the earth. I could hear the great fish behind me, a massive splash as it turned and headed back into the deep. I didn't look up immediately. I just let the sun bake the salt into my skin. It felt like the hand of a father resting on my shoulder. And the Lord spake unto the fish, and it vomited out Jonah upon the dry land. I finally sat up, squinting against the brilliance of the day. I was covered in a layer of, well, let's just call it fish enzymes, and I probably smelled like a seafood market that had been left out in the sun. But I was alive. I was standing on solid ground. I looked out at the horizon. The sea was blue and calm now, a shimmering mirror that hid the wonders I had just seen. I felt a little like a newborn, blinking at a world that seemed far too bright and far too big. But I knew what was coming next. The silence didn't last long. The word of the Lord doesn't just go away because you've had a rough weekend at sea. It was waiting for me, right there in the warm breeze. Arise, go unto Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it the preaching that I bid thee. I stood up, shaking the sand from my cloak. My legs felt a bit wobbly, like they were still trying to find their sea legs, but my heart was steady. I didn't look for a boat to Tarshish this time. I looked for the road that led east. It was a long walk to Nineveh, but after 3 days in a fish, a walk across the desert felt like a stroll through a garden. I had plenty of time to practice my sermon, and plenty of time to think about how I was going to explain my new, aromatic presence to the people I was supposed to warn. The walk to Nineveh was not a short one, but my legs had never felt more purposeful. Every step on the solid, dry, dusty earth was a reminder of the miracle I had just walked out of. The sun was hot, a golden weight on my shoulders that felt like a warm embrace after the cold indigo of the deep. The dust of the road was fine as flour, puffing up around my ankles with every step. Crunch, puff, crunch, puff. It was a rhythmic sound that kept time with my thoughts. I must have been quite a sight for the travelers I passed along the way. My skin was a bit pale, almost bleached from the enzymes of the fish, and my clothes had a certain oceanic character that no amount of desert wind could fully whisk away. I probably looked like a man who had been through a laundry cycle with a leviathan, which, to be fair, was exactly what had happened. As I crested the final hill, Nineveh appeared on the horizon like a mountain made of brick and stone. It was an exceeding great city, a sprawling forest of towers, temples, and markets that stretched further than the eye could see. It was said to be a 3-day journey just to walk across it. The walls were so thick that chariots could race on top of them, and the gates were like the mouths of giants, swallowing up thousands of people every hour. The air changed as I approached the city limits. Gone was the clean, sharp smell of the sea. In its place was a thick soup of smells: roasted meats, open sewers, expensive perfumes, and the dry, metallic tang of thousands of people living far too close together. I remember standing at the entrance, looking up at the massive stone lions that guarded the gate. I felt very small. Not fish-belly small, but a different kind of small. This was a city that didn't know its right hand from its left, a city filled with people who had forgotten who made the stars. So, I took a deep breath, tasting the grit of the city on my tongue, and I began to walk. I didn't have a lute. I didn't have a choir. I just had a voice that had been seasoned by the salt of the Mediterranean, and a heart that finally knew how to listen. I walked for a whole day, deeper and deeper into the heart of the noise and the commerce. Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown, I cried out. My voice felt loud in the narrow streets, bouncing off the mud brick walls, threading its way through the clatter of the marketplace. I expected laughter. I expected stones. I expected the king's guard to haul me away for disturbing the peace. After all, Nineveh was not known for its patience with wandering prophets who smelled faintly of mackerel. But a strange thing happened. The city, this great, roaring engine of a city, began to go quiet. The blacksmith stopped his hammer mid-swing, the rhythmic clink, 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 falling into a sudden, heavy silence. The merchant stopped haggling over the price of silk. The children stopped playing in the gutters. They all turned, their eyes wide, looking at this sun-bleached man with the salt-crusted hair. So the people of Nineveh believed God, and proclaimed a fast, and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them even to the least of them. It was as if a great, invisible hand had reached down and turned the volume of the city to zero. I watched as people, rich people in purple robes and poor people in rags, simply sat down where they stood. They didn't argue. They didn't ask for signs. They heard the word, and the word found the cracks in their hearts. I continued walking, my voice a steady, rhythmic bell in the silence. Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. By the time the news reached the palace, the city was already changing. The smell of cooking fires was replaced by the smell of wood smoke and ash, as people began to mourn for the lives they had lived. It was a transformation so swift and so total that it made my head spin. I found a spot near the center of the city and sat down. The stones beneath me were warm, radiating the heat of the day. I watched a group of noblemen take off their gold chains and replace their fine tunics with rough, scratchy sackcloth. It looked uncomfortable. It looked humble. It looked like the truth. Word came that even the king had risen from his throne. He laid his robe from him, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. He didn't just tell the people to repent. He led the way. He even decreed that the cattle and the sheep should fast. Imagine it, a whole city of thousands, and even the cows were quiet, waiting for a mercy they didn't even have words for. I should have been happy. I should have been dancing. But as I sat there in the settling dust of the afternoon, a familiar, old feeling began to creep back into my heart. A bit of the old Jonah was waking up, and he wasn't quite sure he liked what he was seeing. I walked out of the city gates with a heavy heart. which is a strange thing to say about a man who had just seen 100,000 people turn toward the light. But you must understand, I was tired, I was dusty, and I had a very specific idea of how justice should look. And it didn't look like mercy. It looked like fire, and it looked like the end. The sun was a brazen shield in the sky, pouring down a white, blinding heat that made the horizon dance and shimmer like a liquid dream. I climbed a rocky hill to the east of the city, my sandals crunching on the sun-baked stones, a dry, brittle sound that echoed my mood. I wanted to see what would happen to the city, so I made myself a little shelter, a booth of sticks and dry stalks. It wasn't a very good booth. The wind whistled through the gaps, and the sun found every hole in the thatch, poking at me with needles of heat. I sat there, my back against the rough bark of a stunted tree, watching the city below. The air was still, so still you could hear the distant lowing of the thirsty cattle and the faint, rhythmic chanting of the people in prayer. I was angry. It was a hot, prickly kind of anger. I looked up at the sky, where the blue was so deep it almost looked black. I knew it. I grumbled, my voice a dry rasp in the silence. I knew that thou art a gracious God, and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and repentest thee of the evil. I said it like a complaint. Imagine that. Complaining to the author of life because he chose to give life instead of death. I was so wrapped up in my own sense of fairness that I had forgotten the dark belly of the fish and the way the water had felt when it was trying to swallow my soul. I had forgotten that I was a guest on this earth too, living on borrowed breath. The heat grew heavier as the afternoon wore on. It was a thick, physical weight that pressed against my temples. My skin felt tight and salted, and the shade of my little booth was disappearing as the sun moved across the sky. I felt a deep, heavy exhaustion, the kind that settles in your bones when you've been running for too long, and your legs finally realize they don't have to anymore. I fell into a restless sleep, lulled by the distant hum of the city and the occasional, sharp crack of a dry seed pod. And while I slept, the creator of the winds and the waves decided to do a little gardening. It was a silent miracle. No thunder, no great fish, just the slow, steady, rhythmic unfolding of a leaf in the dark. A gourd plant began to stir in the dry earth near my feet. I could almost hear the sound of the sap rising, a tiny, liquid pulse, as the vine stretched out its green fingers. It grew with a speed that defied the desert, climbing up the sticks of my booth, weaving itself into a living tapestry of emerald and gold. The leaves were broad and soft, like the palms of giant hands, and they felt cool, so incredibly cool, against the parched air. When I woke up, the world had changed. The harsh, yellow glare of the sun was gone, replaced by a soft, dappled green light that filtered through the leaves above me. The air under the vine was sweet and moist, smelling of crushed herbs and fresh water. I reached up and touched a leaf. It was velvety, with tiny, soft hairs that caught the light like silver thread. I felt a surge of joy, a simple, uncomplicated delight in the shade. I was exceeding glad of the gourd, as the scripture says. I sat there for hours, just breathing in the coolness, watching the shadows of the leaves dance across my hands in a slow, rhythmic ballet. It was a small mercy, but it felt bigger than the world. I forgot about Nineveh. I forgot about my anger. I just enjoyed the gift. I leaned my head back, listening to the soft, papery rustle of the vine in the evening breeze. But as the stars began to poke through the green canopy, I didn't know that the Lord was preparing another lesson, one that would come with the dawn. The night was peaceful, the air cooling as the desert exhaled the heat of the day. I slept soundly, tucked under my green roof, while the world turned slowly in the dark. The shadows were long and blue, stretching out toward the mountains, and the heartbeat of the earth was slow and steady. I was a prophet under a vine, a man who had been to the bottom of the sea and back again, still trying to understand the heart of the one who made the gourd grow. The moon rose over Nineveh, a silver sliver that mirrored the shape of the fish's tail. I watched it through the gaps in the leaves, feeling a strange, quiet kinship with the world. We were all being cared for, even when we were too stubborn to see it. The vine didn't ask if I deserved the shade. It just gave it. The silence was deep, a thick, comforting blanket that muffled the city below. The morning air was crisp and thin, the kind of stillness that makes you feel as though the whole world is holding its breath. I woke before the sun, watching the sky transition from a deep, bruised violet to a pale, milky rose. The gourd plant above me was still vibrant, its leaves heavy with the silver dew of the desert night, a cool, liquid treasure that glistened like diamonds in the fading starlight. I felt a sense of ownership over that plant. It was my shade, my comfort, my little island of green in a sea of brown. But as the first sliver of the sun broke over the horizon, God prepared a worm. It wasn't a great fish or a mighty wind, just a tiny, rhythmic creature of the earth, moving with a slow, focused persistence. I didn't see it at first. I only heard the faint, papery sound of a leaf being nibbled, a soft, dry scratching that was almost imperceptible. But by the time the sun had fully cleared the mountains, the miracle of the night before began to wither. The broad, emerald leaves lost their strength, their edges curling into brittle brown scrolls. The vine that had been so full of life just hours ago began to droop, its green fire extinguished as quickly as it had been lit. The heat followed almost immediately. It wasn't just the sun this time, for God prepared a vehement east wind. It was a wind that felt like it had been blown across the coals of a blacksmith's forge. It carried the scent of parched sand and old stones, a dry, thirsty wind that sucked the moisture from my skin and the hope from my heart. The sun beat upon my head, a relentless, rhythmic pounding that made my vision swim. Without the shade of the gourd, I was exposed. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on me until I fainted from the sheer intensity of the light. I sat there, slumped against the dusty earth, feeling the hot grit in my throat, and I wished in myself to die. "It is better for me to die than to live," I muttered, my voice a ghost of itself. And then the voice came. It didn't come in the wind or the heat, but in a quiet, piercing clarity that cut through my self-pity. "Doest thou well to be angry for the gourd?" he asked. The question was a mirror, held up to my own heart. I answered with the stubbornness of a man who had spent 3 days in a fish. "I do well to be angry," I said, "even unto death." I was mourning a plant I hadn't planted, a vine I hadn't watered, a bit of green that had come up in a night and perished in a night. I was more concerned with my own comfort and my own rightness than I was with the thousands of souls breathing in the city below. Then said the Lord, "Thou hast had pity on the gourd, for the which thou hast not labored, neither madest it grow, which came up in a night, and perished in a night. And should not I spare Nineveh, that great city, wherein are more than 60,000 persons that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand, and also much cattle?" The words hung in the shimmering heat, heavier than the sun. I looked down at Nineveh. The city was still there, a vast, breathing organism of brick and life. I thought about the children I had seen in the streets, their laughter as they chased the dust motes. I thought about the cattle, their heavy, rhythmic breathing as they waited for the fast to end. They were all his. Every one of them was a plant he had planted, a life he had watered, a soul he had watched over while they were still in the dark. I sat in the ruins of my booth, the withered vine at my feet, and the silence of the desert was no longer empty. It was full of a mercy so vast that it made the ocean look like a drop in a bucket. I realized that my anger was just a tiny, brittle thing, like the worm-eaten leaf, while his grace was as wide as the sea that had carried me home. The wind began to die down, leaving a lingering warmth that felt less like a desert and more like a hearth. I watched the shadows of the city begin to stretch out, long purple fingers reaching toward the hills. The day was ending, but the lesson was just beginning to take root in the soil of my soul. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of orange and violet embers that seemed to set the very edges of the world on fire. I stood up from my dusty seat on the hillside, brushing the sand from my knees with a slow, rhythmic sweep of my hands. The withered gourd plant lay at my feet, a brittle reminder that my comfort was never the point of the journey. I looked back at Nineveh one last time. The city lights were beginning to flicker to life, tiny sparks of orange in the vast, darkening plain. 120,000 people were tucking themselves into bed, safe under the shadow of a mercy they were only just beginning to understand. And the cattle, yes, even the cattle were settling down for the night, their lowing a soft, distant harmony to the evening breeze. I began the long walk back toward the west, back toward the hills of Galilee. The road was different this time. When I had fled toward Joppa, every step felt like a frantic heartbeat, a desperate attempt to outrun the presence. But now, as I walked toward home, my pace was steady, rhythmic, and light. Crunch, crunch, crunch. My sandals found the familiar language of the earth. The stars began to spill across the sky, a silver tapestry so dense and bright, it felt as though I could reach up and touch the very hem of the Creator's robe. I realized then that I wasn't the hero of this story. I wasn't even the main character. I was just a man who had been given a very damp, very scenic seat to watch the master at work. I thought about the fish. I wondered where it was now, gliding through the deep currents of the Mediterranean, its massive heart still thumping its steady, underwater drum. I felt a strange warmth in my chest, a quiet chuckle that bubbled up and escaped into the night air. I had spent so much energy fighting the will of the one who made the stars, when all along, his will was simply to bring us all home. "The Lord is good to all," I whispered to the moon, "and his tender mercies are over all his works." I didn't need a vine for shade anymore. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of wild jasmine and distant rain. I felt a profound sense of rest, the kind of peace that only comes when you stop trying to be the captain of your own ship and let the current take you where it needs you to go. As I walked, I found myself thinking of you, nestled under your covers, listening to the echoes of my old adventure. I hope you know that the same hand that prepared the fish and grew the vine is the hand that holds you tonight. You don't have to run. You don't have to hide. You are already exactly where you are supposed to be, in the care of the one who never sleeps. The road ahead of me was long, but it was a good road. I knew that when the sun rose tomorrow, his mercies would be new, just like the morning dew on the desert grass. I would reach my home. I would see the olive trees again, and I would tell anyone who would listen that you can never go so far that grace cannot find you. I leaned on my staff for a moment, looking up at the Great Bear as it pivoted slowly around the North Star. The world is so big, and we are so small, but we are never, ever forgotten. Sleep now, little prophet, little traveler. Let the rhythm of your own breath be your guide into the deep, quiet places of rest. The storm has passed. The sea is calm, and the shore is waiting for you when the light returns. May the peace that passes all understanding guard your heart and your mind. I am Jonah, the man who learned to stop running, and I wish you the sweetest of dreams, under the watchful eye of the God of the sea and the dry land. Good night, and may your rest be as deep as the ocean and as steady as the tide.